The first dawn after an armistice is never quiet. Sirens retire and trains wake. Wheels testing rails as if listening for a permission that cannot be granted by ink or signatures. People open shutters to find their streets unchanged and themselves altered, and the dissonance between these truths becomes the work of a generation. The Great War, which had eroded hillsides and habits alike, concluded on a calendar page. Its consequences arrived like the mail day after day, in envelopes of the ordinary. The machine had not only won battles, it had annexed the morning. In the decade that followed 1918, humanity began to notice how extensively the war's gears had slipped into domestic life. The factory whistle became the metronome of towns that used to follow the church bell. Electricity, once novelty, turned into expectation. The clock, transformed by timetables and troop movements, demanded punctuality from bakers and bankers alike. The machine had taught the world a frightening lesson about efficiency, and the world repurposed the lesson in self-defense. If destruction could be coordinated, perhaps recovery could be too. Reconstruction was not a matter of heroics, but arithmetic. Bricks, beams, glass, lime, cement, the elements of resurrection had to be counted with an accountant's cold patience. In the scarred regions of northern France and Belgium, men returned to fields whose soil had learned to hold steel as stubbornly as seed. Plows found shrapnel. Children found badges. Spring found the stubbornness to break through shell holes anyway. Local councils drew up lists: dwellings habitable, dwellings repairable, dwellings beyond hope, and assigned each a number. Numbers made grief legible, if not containable. The arithmetic extended to bodies. Pensions were calculated from lost limbs and lost livelihoods. Mountaintops of paperwork tried to transform pain into currency and rarely succeeded. Widows learned the grammar of forms and stamps. Orphans learned to read names on stone. Hospitals transitioned from emergency to endurance, converting wartime triage into peacetime therapy. There were new words for old sufferings. There were old words that no longer fit. Language struggled to keep up with reality, as it always does when history runs. In cities that had not been bombarded, the war imposed subtler math. Rents climbed, wages lagged, food cost more than memory said it should. The black bread of the home front did not vanish. It diversified into thrift. Housewives became logisticians, stretching week-long meals from day-long budgets. Men who had learned to answer whistles and watches continued to do so beneath factory roofs that no longer minted shells but pressed tins, stamped parts, wound springs. The machine did not demobilize, it merely changed its assignment. Flight, born before the war as a rumor of impossible ambition, acquired during it the status of routine miracle. Pilots had mapped the air with nerves and canvas. Engineers inherited a cartography of wind. In peacetime, the airplane became courier, scout, daredevil, and dream. Barnstormers wrote temporary signatures across rural skies. Businessmen began to think in hours rather than days, between cities hitherto separated by patience. Airfields sprouted at the margins of towns like speculative ideas in a philosopher's notebook. Children watched biplanes taxi and felt a private future tug at them. Adolescents traced contrails with thumbs and imagined continents as neighborhoods. The air organized a new form of distance, the kind that tempts as much as it separates. The war had demanded that the sky be useful. Peace learned to ask it to be beautiful and profitable at once. Yet flight also carried a moral echo the post-war world could not ignore. Bombardment had violated the medieval contract that once promised walls to those who stayed home. Even as airlines painted the airplane as a chariot of modernity, architecture reluctantly adapted to the possibility that roofs might be doors. Civil defense pamphlets, issued with the tone of patient schoolteachers, made a small industry of preparedness. The sky became both invitation and warning. One of the century's most radical revolutions unfolded invisibly, behind plaster and beneath tile. Pipes and wires, assembled with the diligence of monks copying scripture, turned dwellings into small, reliable machines. Hot water entered daily life, as if it had always been owed. Electric light redistributed the evening. Soap, once a commodity, became an assumption. Cleanliness ascended from virtue to infrastructure. These changes altered the tempo of everything. With reliable light, evenings lengthened into hours for reading, mending, listening to radio. With water on command, labor shifted from brawn to ritual. Chores measured time rather than confiscated it. The domestic sphere, which had carried wartime burdens stoically, now experienced the peacetime miracle of convenience so steady it risked invisibility. People began to confuse the ordinary with the eternal. It was a forgivable mistake. Comfort is a persuasive historian. The new house also harbored the war's quiet legacy of design. Standardization, learned from cartridge and component, entered furniture and fixtures. Screws sized by agreement fit more than one chair. Sockets welcomed bulbs made by strangers. Compatibility became a virtue. The machine age had a democratizing effect, masked as tidiness. When things fit, people fit around them more easily. Roads inherited the energy that railways had once monopolized. The war had accelerated the combustion engine's climb from workshop to world. Peace gave it a boulevard. Lorries demobilized into delivery trucks, officers' cars decommissioned into taxis. Asphalt, poured in long black thoughts, made towns continuous with other towns, and the countryside learned a new grammar of approach and departure. The map thickened with intention. Speed entered conversation disguised as convenience. Timetables were replaced by estimates, 15 minutes to here, an hour to there, until the estimates acquired the sacredness of fact. Shopkeepers scheduled by van arrival, cafes synchronized with the afternoon crush of commuters who now lived a geography divided between wage and rest. Rural markets learned to expect produce from farther afield. Urban restaurants learned to claim freshness as a right. Accidents, too, organized themselves. The old perils, falling from horses, tipping carts, yielded to collisions whose violence felt strangely impersonal. Metal met bone. Glass learned to behave like water in the wrong direction. Doctors acquired the repertoire of the new era. Splints for speeds the body could not negotiate. Salves for burns that stung like arithmetic mistakes. Regulations trailed behind reality, as is the custom of rules, until society wrote a treaty with traffic and called it law. If the war had taught the eye to distrust the horizon, radio taught the ear to extend it. Voices arrived from beyond the line of sight, uninvited yet welcomed. Parlor tables made room for wooden cabinets that hummed softly at dusk. Families discovered the ritual of listening together to something not oneself. News took on a new timbre, immediate, disembodied, persuasive. Governments learned to occupy the intimate spaces of the home without knocking. Advertisers learned to sing. The ear, newly powerful, renegotiated society's attention. Sermons shortened, lectures tightened. Political speeches mutated into modular phrases designed to be quoted by tomorrow's mouth. The public square found itself transported into private rooms, preserving the loudness but losing the consequences. The nation experienced itself not as a census, but as an audience. Censorship, already a wartime habit, found peacetime methods. Not all frequencies were equal, not all messages reached. The invisible hand that adjusted the dial became a metaphor that economists mistook for their own. Meanwhile, music, liberated from the geography of concert halls, traveled in grooves and waves. Dance borrowed its courage from records. Solitude borrowed its company from broadcasts. The ear became ruler of evenings. Universities and laboratories absorbed the war's paradox. Science had proven both its genius and its guilt. In response, research split itself into two complementary ambitions: curative and creative. Chemists who had synthesized gas now synthesized dyes, medicines, fertilizers. Physicists who had learned to measure vibrations in steel learned to measure the deep, stubborn vibrations of space and atom. The moral economy of invention rebalanced itself imperfectly, which is to say, honestly. In lecture halls, new metaphors replaced old certainties. The clockwork universe retired with honor. Probability and uncertainty claimed faculty positions. Students left auditoriums with heads full of particles that behaved like riddles. And some of those students wandered into literature and painting, seeking languages equal to their physics. The cross-pollination gave the age its texture, cubist canvases that refused single perspectives, novels that dismantled time and rebuilt it as memory. The workshop of the mind sprawled beyond its walls. Hospitals borrowed that workshop's tools. Prosthetics were no longer crude tickets from disability back to labor. They became collaborations between metal and intention. Therapies for minds unmoored by trenches and barrages matured into disciplines that refused to treat nightmares as misbehavior. It was an era that tried, haltingly, to believe that suffering could be studied without being trivialized. Cities behaved like people who had survived an illness, cautious with their appetites, extravagant with their afternoons. Parks multiplied, as if green could absolve gray. Monuments rose with the gravity of apology. Cafes filled with debates that mistook volume for proof. Galleries staged quarrels between styles that had shared basements during air raids. Streetcars rang their bells with civic optimism. The city was a biography written not in chapters but in thoroughfares. Architecture, instructed by ruin, turned pragmatic without surrendering its ambition. Fireproofing and frames, setbacks and codes, these became the syntax of safety spoken through steel. Yet facades practiced poise. Buildings knew how to stand straight without arrogance. The skyscraper emerged as the century's confession that verticality could forgive density. Lobbies rehearsed the choreography of modern kindness, a doorman, an elevator, a glance that said the future was upstairs. Markets reassembled themselves around novelty. Cinemas learned to imitate dreams at scale. Department stores disciplined desire into aisles. Food traveled farther and appeared out of season, teaching palates to forget calendars. The city, once a collection of trades and parishes, became a theater of options. Choice entered the bloodstream like a stimulant. Passports, scarcely relevant in the 19th century, matured into gatekeepers. War had trained states to classify, count, and confine. Peace decided classification was itself a form of safety. Borders hardened from lines into procedures, and procedures acquired a staff. People learned the choreography of customs: line, stamp, question, gaze. The theater of sovereignty expanded its cast to include everyone. For refugees, still moving in tides that ignored treaties, paper could be ship or anchor. Some found themselves legal by luck, illegal by the same, and discovered that geography now required credentials. The stateless person, a figure forged by collapsed empires, became a permanent resident of the 20th century. Charities issued certificates, consulates issued promises. Neither always worked. The century demonstrated repeatedly that humanity's most intractable problems were administrative. Visas also curated curiosity. A young scholar's permission could redirect a discipline. A musician's invitation could redirect taste. Migration became not just survival, but style. Cities acquired accents they had not earned, and earned them in time. Agriculture learned industrial grammar during the war. Peacetime asked it to conjugate abundance. Tractors inherited the urgency of artillery. Fertilizers inherited the ambition of chemists who once imagined conquest as crop. The field, mechanized, expanded its calendar. Harvest grew less dependent on weather and more dependent on maintenance. Rural life transformed almost as radically as urban life, though with less exhibition. Yet fields also preserved the century's conscience. In them lay unexploded shells, unclaimed bones, iron that would work its way to the surface with the patience of geology. Farmers developed a ritual of spring that included the tender exhumation of small wars from their soil. Memory was not a monument only. It was a harvest. Children grew up understanding that history fed the ground as surely as rain. Democracy emerged from the war wounded, but widened. The franchise expanded in many countries. Parliaments learned to welcome voices previously counted only during mobilization. Labor, which had kept factories humming under the whip of necessity, insisted on recognition once the whip was put away. Strikes rehearsed the choreography of dissatisfaction. Newspapers translated it into debates about fairness that sound eternal, because they are. Women, who had proven indispensable everywhere except in constitutional prefaces, demanded an edit. The war had made a ledger of their contributions. Peace now read it aloud. Votes, professions, degrees, offices, The list of access grew year by year, never fast enough for justice and never slow enough for opposition. Fashion narrated the argument in fabric. Education narrated it in syllabi. The body politic felt its limbs for the first time and found both strength and pins and needles. And extremes also gathered their voters. Humiliation and hunger proved eloquent. Movements arose, promising the speed of solutions the machine had taught people to crave. Uniforms re-entered public life with a swagger that suggested the war had changed costume, not character. The center, tasked with the unglamorous labor of patience, did not always hold. Schools interpreted the war as a failure of knowledge and character, and set out to repair both. Curricula modernized with the zeal of penance. Geography emphasized interdependence. Literature admitted voices that contradicted victory. Civics added the study of institutions designed to mediate rage. History textbooks learned slowly to distinguish between dates and consequences. Children born in 1914 arrived at adolescence with memories inherited rather than lived. They carried photographs of uncles they had never met, visited cemeteries as if touring sentences in a language they were only beginning to learn. Teachers balanced reverence with inoculation, aware that memory without understanding can harden into myth. Assemblies developed silences measured carefully to fit attention spans. The Minute of Remembrance became an annual exercise in national breathing. Universities institutionalized the hope that thought could avert repetition. New disciplines, international relations, communications, social psychology, promised to study conflicts as solvable puzzles. The optimism was noble, provisional, and necessary. Religion, philosophy, and art convened a marketplace that thrived because certainty had gone out of stock. Sanctuaries filled with those who sought the grammar of loss. Galleries filled with those who sought the syntax of fracture. Atheists argued with reverends by writing novels. Mystics argued with physicists by painting light. Theaters staged plays in which time misbehaved. Poets sculpted stanzas that preferred honesty to symmetry. Popular taste, meanwhile, found itself seduced by rhythms, imported and adapted along trade routes older than the war, but accelerated by it. Jazz carried both sorrow and wit across oceans. Dance learned to honor both restraint and abandon in a single evening. Culture became an atlas where no one continent could claim the legend. Meaning increasingly felt like a craft one practiced, rather than a doctrine one adopted. People curated their beliefs as carefully as their living rooms, selecting items that fit together less by rule than by resonance. The century, having learned that dogma can draft armies, began to admire ambivalence as a moral accomplishment. Prosperity, when it arrived in bursts, was never pure. Loans crosshatched the Atlantic like unspooled string. Reparations threaded Europe with knots. The war's financial architecture, improvised under pressure, remained in place out of habit and hope. When markets trembled, they did so in sympathy across oceans. The realization that fortune had become planetary dawned slowly, and then all at once. Bust followed boom with the grim punctuality of a timetable. Factories that had pivoted triumphantly from shells to radios pivoted again to silence. Men who had learned to be soldiers learned to be unemployed. Patience, aditukum, that underrated civic virtue, thinned. The machine that had promised productivity without limit demonstrated that it could produce idleness just as efficiently. Policy learned the rhythm of emergency. Citizens learned the rhythm of queue. In the long view, the storm confirmed what the war had already suggested, that independence, whether of person or nation, was increasingly a fable everyone needed and no one possessed. Interdependence was the true condition, and it demanded a politics adults might accept and romantics would dislike. Even as the century organized itself around steel and idea, people continued to plant gardens. They did so for food, for solace, for ritual. Gardening recovers a truth the machine cannot counterfeit. Growth takes time, and time resists acceleration. War had tried to edit time by compression. The garden restored the long sentence. City allotments persisted from wartime necessity into peacetime habit. Grandparents instructed grandchildren in plots bounded by twine and patience. Seeds arrived in paper envelopes that felt like letters from a benign future. The act of watering became a small ceremony of refusal, a refusal to accept that the world was only gears and votes and news. Meanwhile, maps, on classroom walls, in newspapers, in the pockets of travelers, reminded everyone that borders could be redrawn faster than tomato vines could climb, and with consequences more lasting than any season. The garden and the map argued quietly for the rest of the century. One taught humility, the other taught caution. Together, they kept the human scale in view. By the late 1920s, a child born the day the guns fell silent could ride a bus lit by electricity, listen to a concert transmitted by air, drink water warmed in a tank hidden in a closet, and sleep beneath a roof whose beams were designated by code. None of these conveniences announced themselves as gifts from catastrophe. They masqueraded as the natural progress of cleverness. Yet beneath the wallpaper, the war had left its wiring. The ordinary became the century's most consequential monument. Not the arch, not the statue, not the plaza in which dignitaries draped wreaths, but the morning routine. Switch, tap, latch, button, book, street. Civilization, which had proven itself capable of ending itself, answered with rituals of continuance that succeeded so well we mistook them for givens. The most radical achievement of the post-war world was not ideology, it was reliability. To maintain reliability is work. Municipal crews that clear drains after storms, nurses that change bandages at dawn, mechanics who listen to engines the way doctors listen to lungs. These became the custodians of peace more than diplomats in borrowed rooms. The lesson was unfashionable but enduring. The opposite of war is not ceremony but maintenance. Each era has its instrument. For the years after the Great War, the instrument was the machine, tuned to serve rather than to command, and it played the music of mornings resumed. This did not cancel the darkness that followed later in the century. No narrative is strong enough to annul what history eventually insisted upon. But for a while, in many places, people practiced the art of ordinary courage, paying bills, raising children, fixing roofs, arguing politely, voting imperfectly, extending a hand need to neighbors whose grief had different nouns. If the war proved that humans can coordinate destruction at scale, the morning after proved that they can coordinate care. The difference is not romantic. It is logistical and moral. Steel remembers the shape it was bent into. So do habits. We inherit both. The task that began in 1918, build systems that bend toward flourishing and maintain them, is not finished, which is one of the ways we recognize it as worthy. Somewhere, a century later, a farmer's spring plow still lifts an old belt buckle from the soil. Somewhere, a child still turns a radio's descendant to hear a song from a city she has not yet seen. Somewhere, a widow still traces a name on a stone until the cold in her fingers reminds her to go home and put the kettle on. And everywhere, morning arrives with its thousand switches and taps and schedules, asking, without the flourish of trumpets, what kind of world the living plan to run today. The machine waits for the answer. The morning, as ever, insists that we provide it.